Hello, everyone. Welcome to yet another one of our speakers series on gender-based violence. Before we start, just a reminder that this is streaming live on Facebook, and we are recording it and will upload this on YouTube. We'll start off with a land acknowledgement, and then I will hand it over to Amma, who is our speaker for today. Really exciting stuff. Welcome to all of you who are here. I'm sure it will be great and engaging discussion. My name is Dr. Tapo. I'm the founder of Future Black Female. And I would like to start off by saying Future Black Female acknowledges that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and acknowledging this land and our presence on this land reminds us that our great standard of living, the peace that we enjoy, is directly related to the resources and friendship of Indigenous peoples. So thank you on behalf of Future Black Female. And now I'll hand over to Amma.
Beautiful. Thank you, Dr. Teppel, for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation with all of you. My name is Amma Gyamfowa, and it's really amazing to be joining you on this Wednesday night in your homes, in your space. Although it's snowing outside, it's a really interesting and important conversation to talk about healthy relationships and what that can look like for young Black women, especially. I'm going to let you know that I'm a really interactive speaker. So we'll have some activities and we'll have some exercises. And I know that we are currently recording. So we'll try our best to just navigate that and making people hopefully feel comfortable and as safe as possible. And so if there's times where you have questions or things that you want to say, you can feel free to write them in the chat, or you can message me privately or Dr. Teppel, and we can kind of integrate some of your comments. But if you also feel comfortable unmuting yourself and speaking out loud, I really want to encourage that as well. I am many things, including a daughter, a friend. I'm of Ghanaian descent, which means I'm a Jollof warrior. And I'm also a social worker and a therapist, and really come at my work in terms of embracing ourselves and our identities as Black women. And so that's what today is about. It's about thinking about what does a richer love look like for you. And for us to talk about healthy relationships, we also have to talk about gender-based violence and unhealthy relationships as well, that allow us to be able to get to the destination of where it is that we want to go and how we can better identify what is a healthier, richer experience of love and relationships, whether it be with our partners, with our friends, and also with our family as well. So welcome everyone to tonight. Okay. And so a couple of things to just think about as we ground our space and our time together. One of the big things for me is always just acknowledging and sharing your wisdom, right? I think sometimes when therapists or social workers or certain people in certain fields come into a space, everyone gets really quiet, but I really want to acknowledge that a lot of you have many things to offer, and recognizing that relationships teach us so much, and you have the opportunity, if you're feeling comfortable, to share some of your experiences, whether that be once again in the chat or unmuting yourself. But I really just want to encourage people to acknowledge and share your wisdom, because so many other people in this space can also learn from you. I'm not the only person that can share information. The second thing is using I statements. So we may be coming at this and talking about relationships in a lot of different ways. And there's a lot of connection and affirmation that you might get from hearing other Black women speak about their experiences. But the other thing to kind of think about as well is that sometimes we want to really make sure we're speaking from our own lived experiences, so we don't feel like we're talking for other people. It's third here, but it's one of the things that I want people to think about and consider throughout is how do you care for yourself and your needs in this space? So I know that talking about relationships can be fun and interesting, but can also be very, very difficult, especially when we begin talking about gender-based violence and other aspects of violence. And so thinking about what it means for you to take care of yourself in this moment, whether it means that you might have to walk away, whether it means you have to eat your food or talk to your parents or your family members. And then also thinking about just different things you can do to soothe yourself. I'm a coffee drinker, but I've finished my coffee for the day. Some people are tea drinkers. I always have a blanket now that I'm at home and it's kind of wrapped around me. So just thinking about, yes, I see another tea/coffee drinker in the house. So just think about what you can do to kind of take care of yourself while you're here with us. And this is, of course, a space of non-judgment, right? We want to make sure that people are able to talk about some of their complicated experiences. And in order to do that, we have to really come from this at a space of not holding or putting any of our judgments in the space. And one of the last things to kind of think about as well is creating safety through confidentiality. So you might learn a lot of different things, you might hear a lot of different experiences, but I encourage and ask people to leave the stories here and then take with them the wisdom. So take with them that boundaries is a new way to go, if that makes sense, right? Is there anything else that people would feel comfortable making sure that our space has? And one of the things for us to think about or to do is you can either personally message me in the chat or you can write it in the chat publicly. But is there anything else in addition to some of the things that you see here that would allow you to feel safe or allow you to feel comfortable as we kind of navigate talking about healthier relationships? Okay. Sounds good. And so I know sometimes people want an agenda, so I thought I would share some of the things that we're going to be talking about. Some of it actually gets a little bit deeper and we'll kind of flesh out those layers as we go forward. But these are some of the general things that we'll be talking about. And once again, I'll be trying to do it in an interactive way so it doesn't feel too dry. I want to have a conversation with you. So feel free to engage in ways that you feel most comfortable in. Okay. So breaking the ice and getting to know folks. So there are a couple people that are familiar to me in different ways in this space, but there's some people that are definitely new to me as well. And so one of the things that I wanted to do was just ask people, one, what are some of the things that you might be hoping to gain from this space? And then the other thing to help break the ice and get a little bit of an understanding of where people are at is one of two icebreakers that you can choose from. The first one being, if you were to describe or name relationships with a movie title or a book, what would you name it and why? And then the second one is, if you were to tweet relationship advice to your younger self, what would it be? Obviously, maybe everyone doesn't have Twitter, and even if you do have Twitter, you don't have to use it, but just a quick sentence or two about advice you would have given your younger self when it comes to healthier relationships or navigating relationships in general. And once again, you can write in the chat or unmute yourself if you feel comfortable.
I can go.
Awesome.
I'll go with quick change of mind. I'll actually go with the second one. So if I were to describe my relationship or any relationship with a movie title, I'm gonna name it Love Don't Cost a Thing.
Good title.
Yeah. And why? The title literally says it. So it doesn't matter what kind of relationship it is. It could be personal relationship. It could be, boyfriend and girlfriend. It could be just with your girlfriends. The love doesn't really shouldn't cost you anything.
Mm-hmm.
And you should always, treat them as you would love to be treated.
Mm-hmm. Yes, what a way to start us off. Thank you for that. And anything that you're hoping to gain from this space?
Just to be able to gain how to have and also maintain healthy relationships.
Beautiful. Thank you for starting us off.
You're welcome.
What about other people? And once again, you can unmute yourself or you can type in the chat.
So hi, my name's Sabat.
Hello.
And so if I were to describe or name a relationship with a book title, I don't know, something that comes to mind is the book, I just picked it up this weekend, Things Fall Apart. And I also mentioned that because I've been thinking a lot about how I've seen a lot of relationships in romantic relationships in my family that I don't want to see replicated. And then also where things have kind of fallen apart, but there's kind of the force to put it back together. And not actually doing that with work and care and like intentionality. And I think, and then also like thinking a lot about how we kind of over idealize like length in relationships as opposed to like, are people happy, are like all of that kind of a thing. So, and that's something like I've been thinking a lot about lately. So some things fall apart and sometimes we should let them and like move on, or at least, you know, consciously put work in as opposed to, you know, and I know that also some people, especially, you know, Black women, our foremothers have access to different resources and have had access to different resources in our peers. So that informs how and why we stay in some relationships, for sure. But yeah, that's something I've been thinking about and related to relationships. And what I'm hoping to gain from the space is just a place to connect with other Black women and kind of get different perspectives on relationships and that kind of a thing, and maybe equip myself with some more tools. And yeah, and also tenure this session that you're running, and you're always really great at workshop facilitation and that kind of a thing. So I'm really happy to be here.
Yes, thank you for joining, Sabat. I hope you're doing well. And that's such important, you're naming something so important, right? Which is that oftentimes you can say, oh, I've been around, and this, once again, this is in connection to friends and romantic relationships. Oh, they've been in my life for 10 years. They've been in my life for 5 years. But what does the relationship actually look like? Is it a reciprocal relationship? Is it a relationship that you feel safe? Or is it a relationship that you feel like maybe doesn't nurture you in the same ways that it used to? And what does that look like when we are recognizing that our relationships are falling apart? So thank you for bringing that. I also love that book title. I think somebody else said it in the chat as well. And then Jade placed, if I can tweet relationship advice to my younger self, I would say, don't be too eager, take time. Yes, 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 yes. And I saw a couple nods, so I'm sure there's other people that can relate to that. Any other folks want to go and help us break the ice before we move forward?
I'll go.
Awesome.
My name is Sakina, and I'm gonna answer the third question. I would tell my younger self that it's okay to be assertive. You don't really have to please everyone. Yeah. Beautiful.
Yeah, and I think it's something so simple and direct, but oftentimes we're not affirmed with that, right? We're not given that information. So thank you for naming that as well. Any final folks want to go before we move forward into the next area and get really started in our conversation today?
I'll go ahead. I think.
Oh, sorry.
So sorry. You can go ahead.
All right. My name is Simona. I was gonna go ahead and answer the last question, a tweet about advice I'd give myself. I think that would be that relationships are they are work. Stuff like fondness, like being fond of somebody, or like companionship, like those things are a little bit easier. But when it comes to relationships, it is like constantly working because people aren't perfect. You're the person you're in a relationship with, as well as like things are always changing, dynamics are always changing. So it is work, but it's rewarding work at the same time.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for joining us, Simona. And then there was somebody else who was also about to speak at the same time, but I couldn't catch the name.
Hi, my name is Ruby. So what I was I'm actually gonna merge the last two questions. So relationship advice that I would give to my younger self would be the movie title, He's Just Not That Into You. I think that sometimes when we're younger, we try to like pick up on clues and we're like doing mathematics to figure out if this person likes you or doesn't like you. And I think, you know, it's important to see people for who they really are and to see actions for what they really are and to, you know, not try to read too much into things, but really take it as it comes and to know your worth. So, yeah.
Yeah, that mental gymnastics, you named it perfectly. Beautiful. And then we have in the chat as well, the power of mind would be my title, because the mind has the power to impact the relationships of love. Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you all for sharing and getting us started. And I'm sure those titles are going to kind of be circulating as we go forward as well. Okay, and so I know this sounds like a really funny question, but I think it's an important space to start us off at. And the icebreaker allowed us to slowly begin thinking about what is our relationship with relationships at this point, right? And whether it be a thought, a word, an emotion, or a movie or a book title like we began naming before, it's really important for us to just check in with ourselves, right? Because the reality is that at any moment in time, our relationships are being shaped by so many different things, whether it be our own lived experiences, whether it be how somebody else is showing up. And we have to be really, really mindful as we go forward and thinking about critically what it is that we want or desire from our relationships. Where is our starting point and where are we trying to get to? What are we trying to alter? Okay. And so I often talk about a bridge when it comes to mental health, because I find, well, one, you guys are going to learn I'm a very animated person in some ways, expressive, but I'm also a really big visual learner. So I often need objects to explain things, to allow me to just process it in certain ways. And so I'll talk about one way to look at relationships through this idea of a bridge, right? And we're going to start off by thinking about the two bridges, right? And the two bridges that are starting us off or shaping our experiences as young Black women is often our parents. Their lived experiences, their realities, the troubles or the difficulties, and even some of the beautiful things that they've experienced in their life. Those two bridges coming together to create us also allow us to examine and to look at our relationships in a particular way. And so from the very day that we're born, we're on this bridge of relationships, whether it be with our parents, our family members, our community members. And so thinking about and considering this bridge analogy is going to be really helpful as we go forward to the next part. But also it might be another way for you to think about when difficulties or challenges happen in relationships, how do you begin moving with them in a different way? Okay. And so one of the things that are on our bridges as we move forward in relationships is puddles. And puddles are what I consider to be the small little things that kind of happen in relationships, hiccups, whether it be, you know, you fell out with one of your friends in grade 8, and then you guys were able to kind of come back together in grade 10. Whether it be that you had a small little challenge or miscommunication with somebody in one of the relationships that you had, but it was a really easy thing for you both to walk past and move forward. The second thing on our bridge are holes. And this is when somebody breaks our trust. This is when somebody hurts our boundaries, violates us in certain ways. And it's something that I consider a needing repair, right? It's something that needs time, that's effort. And I can't remember who said it, but I think it was Simona actually talked about relationships being work. There's a certain amount of effort that has to be put in from people in order to allow a relationship to be nurtured. And then there's what I consider our bricks, right? And our bricks sometimes are stemming from our family's experiences, our cultural experiences as Black women, but I consider it and name it to be some of the heavy things that we might be carrying along our journey. And some of those things came with us, right? Meaning the sense that your parents might have experienced some form of neglect or challenge or difficulty. And so it has become hard for them to show or express love, or how they showed up in your life really challenged your perceptions of love. And then there's also bricks that we end up carrying along the way in our experiences as Black women, whether that be colorism, whether that be representations that we might have in the media. And so thinking about that analogy and thinking about the bricks, I want us to slowly begin identifying, what are some of our individual bricks, right? And once again, those heavy experiences that we might be carrying or difficult experiences that we're carrying in relationships, but then also what are the bricks that are imposed on us? And those are the larger systems, the larger challenges that we might have or experience collectively as Black women. And so I know that's a big mouthful. If people have questions about that metaphor, feel free to ask in the chat or unmute yourself. But I have this question about then what bricks is shaping and impacting our experiences as young Black women when we're in relationships?
Could it be maybe transitioning from toxic to healthy relationship?
Yeah, absolutely. And why would that be a brick for somebody in a relationship?
Just because maybe they're used to, the toxicity, and now they have to deal with healthy relationships, and it might be hard for them to figure out if it might be hard for them to figure it out, pretty much.
Yeah, absolutely, right? That the norm becomes the toxic thing, right? And so we carry that in the relationship, and we expect the yelling, we expect the arguing, we expect a lot of this, different power imbalances to happen when that other person might be offering something completely new or completely outside of that unhealthier version of love. Jade.
I think what could be a brick could also be like childhood neglect and feeling like because of that now you have to be independent to the exclusion of ever asking anyone else for help. And so when you get into partnership with people, like your partner may be saying, hey, I see that you have a lot on your plate, or you're taking on a lot, like, can I help you? And always like, you're just always telling them like, no, I got it, I can handle it. But then like, that's kind of building a wedge in the relationship because now you're not allowing like that bid for a connection to be fulfilled. Like you're denying your partner's bid to help you. So like, that can contribute to like relationship breakdown. So yeah.
Absolutely a very powerful example, because once again people might be offering something new, but because of that earlier experience in childhood or those earlier experiences of what we saw love as, we feel like, okay, we got to do it all on our own. But the reality is that now somebody is here in our space wanting to support us, wanting to show up in a different way, and wanting to experience love with us in a particular way, but we might have felt so unsafe in the past that it feels hard to feel vulnerable. What about other folks? What are some other bricks? And I've slowly began adding them here. Jade talked about parental wounds. What do family, community, and cultural and religious expectations look like for Black women, and how does that, or might that be a brick in our experiences?
I think something with me, and also kind of related to this, that is like feeling inadequate. And like you're never good enough. I think it's also because like, from our communities and stuff, we also set like impossible standards, like for being a Black woman and navigating these things correctly. Wow. So there's so many things that were perceived as like failing as, or like, the bar is so much higher for us, that it like feels like kind of impossible. And I kind of also feel that like imposed from community. Like I feel like there's so many things mediating how I'm supposed to show up, and how I'm supposed to show up as a Black Muslim woman, and how I'm supposed to navigate relationships in ways that aren't like, similarly also seen in my community with men and all of that. So yeah, that's something that comes to mind for me.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for sharing that and making that connection, that overextension of self, right? And the reality is that it's coming from all these different pressures, like pulling us in together. But then how do we slowly begin to internalize that, okay, well, that's just what I'm supposed to do because I saw my mom do it, or I see my auntie do it. What about other folks? What are some other things we can name as bricks? would be acceptance. Absolutely. Is, do we think we'll be fully accepted as we are when we're showing up in our relationships, right? Any other person want to add to this idea of our bricks? The media, yes. How does the media impact us in a way that is heavy and kind of represents that brick that I was talking about on our bridge? And I'm not pointing you out. If there's other people that want to add to media, and we can talk about movies, we can talk about social media, we can talk about any kind of form of media. Jade.
I feel like a lot of times with like Black representations of love for, again, like Black women, a lot of times Black women are portrayed to be in like struggle love relationships. And so like it's always like the man is like doing her absolute dirt, but she's riding by him, she's sticking by her man. And like I feel like you don't really take that in when you're like a little girl growing up, but then I feel like you kind of internalize it subconsciously. You start to find yourself in those similar type of relationships because that's the only thing that's been like modeled to you in the media as valid for someone that looks like you.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm wondering as well, so there's the part of how we show up in relationship that is connected to, but there's also ways that people around us, I know everybody has maybe had maybe not everybody, but some of us might have had conversations with our aunties or our moms or maybe other Black women in our life who kind of said, yeah, like you just have to deal with it. I've had countless aunties tell me, oh, like, having a man is like having another child. It's like, well, then damn, well, where does that place me, right? What type of labor am I going to be doing if that's how I'm looking at things? So you're absolutely right, Jade, that there's this idea that we have to kind of consistently sacrifice in order to experience love. And that can be unhealthy, and really burdensome in trying to be in a mutually beneficial and reciprocal relationship. Awesome. Any other folks want to add before we move forward? Culture, yes. How does culture add a brick in our experiences around love and relationships? And I'm not picking on you. Anyone can kind of jump in, type in the chat, or unmute yourself. Rachel.
I think like certain things that maybe we grew up seeing, like for me, for example, I remember being younger and like seeing the way that my grandparents would be with each other and not really necessarily liking it. Like my grandpa sitting down at the table and being like, go get me my food, or like waiting for him. And I would say to myself, like, I never want to be with a man that treats me like that. And then my mom telling me like when she was young and she would see those things and she would say the same thing to herself. But some things like, I guess like some things in West Indian culture, the man can be very domineering and controlling. And I guess that's just the norm, but it can sometimes feel like when you're resisting that, it's almost taken as being disrespectful. And it would make me upset sometimes to see my grandma like complying to that behavior, but her just saying, oh, that's the way it is.
Of course.
So yeah.
Yeah, and definitely, part of it is like a survival tool for them, right? It's like, this is what people might tell themselves to help get through the difficulties of a really unbalanced relationship. But yeah, it can be really difficult to see those dynamics kind of taking place in so many different ways. And especially when it's connected to culture, right? It's like, then how do we resist that? How do we challenge it and change that? And we'll talk about what that looks like as well. Thank you for sharing that, Rachel. And I'll share a couple more comments in the chat and then we'll move forward. And somebody has placed here, there's also the social media, Black movie discourse to be with the tall, dark, handsome person. Yeah, absolutely, right? Like there's this knight in shining armor that's gonna come. And it's always the assumption that it's gonna be a man. There's never other genders around within those romantic relationships as well. And that can be really erasing for queer Black folks, right? And then another person has said, values instilled in us when growing up can impact our relationships. Of course. And, I know sometimes seeing all of these things here can feel really difficult and feel heavy. But part of the reason why I wanted to include it in us talking about relationships and healthy relationships is sometimes is one that we feel like it's only us or only our experience or only our family. And the reality is that oftentimes, especially as young Black women and folks, there's so many different ways in which we're experiencing all these things at the same time. And so it feels heavy when we're talking about relationships, but we don't know why. And it feels unsafe to be in relationships, but we're not necessarily sure. And so I use this example of the bricks to really just hopefully give us a lot of different ways and perspectives of seeing the connections between our experiences and how we might show up in our relationships. And once again, this is across relationships, right? Carrie Ann, and then we can move forward.
Oh, I just wanted to talk about the acceptance that I sent in the chat. And
Of course, go ahead.
how you can and for culture too, because that plays a big role, a big part of that.
Mhm.
If you're strong, say for example, if you're a strong woman and you stand up for yourself, you get labeled and people talk about, oh, you will not get married because you're gonna want to beat off your husband and you're gonna this, you're gonna that. So all of that, it just brings a negative look to you when you want to, as a young lady, when you want to go inside of a relationship and the goals that you have for a relationship, you just look at it I don't know. You just don't want to approach it. You don't want to move because you get labeled, oh, because if you're strong and you stand up for yourself, oh, culture wise, then you're not supposed to do that. Oh,
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You're saying something that's so powerful, which is how do people try to make us smaller than we are, right? How do people want us to show up smaller so that they can feel bigger in our relationships? And I have something that I call my small girl syndrome, right? Which is the idea that oftentimes as a young African woman and a young Black woman, I just felt that there are ways that culture can be very empowering and at the same time make us feel like we have to be small. And so I know often people talk about imposter syndrome, but the reality is that there's also ways that we end up showing smaller than ourselves in our personal relationships because of that idea of culture and acceptance. So thank you for sharing that. Okay. So I know that this is a heavy slide, but we're going to move forward. But I just once again wanted to affirm and connect the dots between some of our experiences and the bricks. And part of the reason why I use the word bricks is because we also have to work to dismantle them and resist them in different ways. And it allows us to kind of slowly then beginning to think about, okay, if these are the bricks, if these are the challenges, if these are the things that we might be carrying with us, then what does that mean we have to be reframing, reshaping love as, and our templates of love going forward if we're knowing that these are some of the experiences that we might be carrying with us. And so I have these 3 questions here, and we may not be able to explore all of them, but I think we were able to connect some of them already or answer some of these questions, right? And so some of the questions I have here is, how is love shown or hidden as a result of these bricks, right? How are we expected to show up in relationships as Black women? And Sabat talked about overextending, right? That we end up feeling like there are family, cultural, community, and religious expectations that we always have to overextend ourselves. And then what does that do to us, right? It exhausts us. It exhausts us. And then it also doesn't allow the space for other people to show up in the ways that they're also supposed to show up in relationships. And the last thing to think about is thinking around if these are the bricks, right? If these are the things that some of us might be carrying or collectively we might be carrying, then what is it that we want to release and resist in repeating? And so, I'll kind of share, I run a mentorship program for young Black women. And I remember in 2020, and a couple of beautiful people are here, I won't put you on blast, but I remember in our spaces, part of the thing that I thought was so beautiful was that people really were beginning to reject the idea of the strong Black woman, right? And so that's one of the things that can be a really important reality. And how do you begin to redefine love, right? And I know even online now, it's like this really common thing to say, I want soft life, right? What does that mean? But I wonder if there's any other things that you're slowly beginning to release or resist in order to no longer keep some of the bricks that we talked about not too long ago with us. And Kashimba, did I say your name right?
You could just call me Tori. My name is Victoria, but yeah.
Sounds good.
I think one of the things that I'm learning to reject definitely is the idea of not getting help. I struggle a lot because like I've always been the type of person that really shows out for like my friends or like my family. Like I'm always trying to be their person, and I never realized that it was at the expense of my own peace. Because like you take like when you're helping other people, you're taking in every single experience that they're sharing with you, and then I would find myself sometimes when like I'm struggling. Everyone would kind of assume that I'm okay because I wouldn't put it out there to say like, well, I'm kind of struggling right now. Yeah. And whenever people would offer help, it would be really hard because I'm like, okay, it's scary because you never really know if people are being genuine. So you're just kind of like, is it like, do you really want to help? Like, and I think I'm realizing more that opening up isn't the worst thing. And they really are people that look out for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And you give them a chance once we do become, or once people show us that they're a safe person, right? And then the other part is like, how do we then respond to recognizing like, okay, this person's a safe person, I'm trusting this person, and I'm going to take these baby steps to vulnerability so that they can show up for me in new ways. So thank you for that. Are there any other things people want to identify as ways that they've been kind of slowly trying to break down their bricks, or release or resist some of the patterns that they might have seen previously, whether it be in other relationships or relationships that you might have seen, you know, older people in your family have or hold? I know they're heavy questions. Jade, go ahead.
I think a lot of times in relationships, we get into this, like we have this mindset that like, oh, if I bring up this thing that like bothered me or hurt my feelings, it's gonna cause a fight or conflict, or like they're gonna leave me or gonna break up, whatever. And I feel like that holds a lot of people back from expressing themselves authentically and fully in relationship, and this causes the relationship to fall apart later on down the road. And what I've come to like realize slowly through like just practicing like that, stepping out of that mindset, is that like someone who cares about you will not see you sharing your feelings as a slight against them, or uh or like an opportunity to cause a conflict. Like they're gonna want to work it out with you. And so I think it's just important to keep that in mind when we're in whatever relationship, romantic or platonic. Like if this person really cares about me, then me sharing what's going on or what's not going on in our relationship is not gonna cause it to fall apart.
Absolutely, absolutely. And even if it takes a second for you all to go through the difficult conversation as well, right?
Yeah.
Beautiful. You can go ahead.
Hi, so I was gonna say something I would like to resist repeating is probably staying in like a toxic relationship with the hopes that they're gonna change the person. So, you know, as a Black woman, I need to protect myself, and that's something that I would not like to repeat.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And I know that that's a common thing. I feel like we're going to talk about toxic relationships in a bit, but I feel like over the last couple of years, when we finally realized, wait, this is toxic? Okay, I'm not ready to engage in this anymore. And so it's really important that we're able to even identify that, like, okay, this actually is toxic, right? There's something here that makes me feel unsafe, makes me feel uncomfortable. And I get the ability to be able to decide that I do not want to engage in this anymore because it doesn't feel like that richer love for me, right? Awesome. All right. So hands up if like people have watched this show. I could be telling on myself. But there's a purpose as to why I'm bringing this up. Okay, a couple hands. Anyone else watching Insecure? I'm seeing a couple. Okay. Beautiful. Okay, so I'm not feeling alone. Awesome. And so part of the reason why I brought this show up is because it's a really interesting it has really highlighted relationships in a lot of different ways. And part of the reason why I bring it up is because I think there's ways that we see either ourselves or other people around us connected to these characters. And I feel like there's a couple of things in the chat. Insecure, yes, I love show. Okay, beautiful. And so I want people to begin slowly thinking about connecting the bricks that we talked about earlier. And the unfortunate thing about Insecure was that we couldn't see earlier. I wish sometimes that we were able to like flashback, like, how was your childhood? What happened? So that we have a better understanding of how people show up. But I say all of that to say that these characters can be used as really thinking about, okay, how are we showing up in different ways in our relationships, right? And so people can write in the chat, like, what are some of the words or the feelings that you get when you look at some of these characters, or the ways that you feel like they showed up in relationships that were very interesting, or just things that you observed during watching the show as a whole. Yes, Jade.
Honestly, I thought it was strange for how close Molly and Issa were when they were in conflict. Like things were like building up, like the tension was mounting. Why they couldn't like set each other aside and be like, hey, this is how I'm feeling. Like, are you feeling this too? Like, how can we work through this? I thought that was strange because I'm like, you guys, I thought you guys are best friends. That shouldn't be difficult for you. So I don't know. I just thought it was weird, but like, you could also see how like they kind of were holding on resentment because they were not having these conversations.
Yeah, definitely. And especially because it seems like they were at least friends for, let's say, 10 years, right? So it's like, how come, I wonder why, it's been hard for you all to kind of figure out a way to communicate with one another that is healthier, as opposed to kind of sweeping certain things under the rug until they blow up in the ways that they did, right? So I have a couple people saying messy, saying reflection, ego, pride, any other words that come to people's mind, and they can write it in the chat or unmute themselves about just like, what are some of the things that or ways that you feel like people showed up in this show. And that's if you watched it. I know for some people who might not have watched it, this might be a weird exercise. Okay. Go ahead, Rachel.
I was gonna say that, well, it's not one word, but I'll try and make it quick. But it kind of reminds me of like, if anyone else knows the show Girlfriends, like Molly kind of reminds me of Tony, and the way that like the same way that Tony and Joan seem like so different, but they're still friends. It's like Issa and Molly, and it kind of reminds me of like a friendship I had that I actually don't have anymore, because I just realized that, like how someone else mentioned, in relationships in general, not just intimate relationships, you can't always think you're going to change someone. And sometimes like it is fine to be different from each other, but sometimes when you don't align with certain like core values or ethics and things like that, then it can't really work. So
yeah, definitely. And I bring this up because I think it was just a really interesting look. So oftentimes when you're like in a certain field, and for me, I'm in mental health and social work. And so honestly, sometimes I'm watching TV, I'm trying to turn off my brain, but there's these other things that are popping up, right? And as I mentioned earlier, it would have been beautiful to see or to witness, like, okay, what were some of their earlier experiences that's actually shaping the reasons why Molly and Issa can't actually communicate with one another when a challenge happens, or why Lawrence keeps popping up the way he does, or even just Molly's dating relationship and history, right? And so it got me just really thinking about, how do we begin then thinking around and reflecting on the attachment we received as we grew up, right? And I'm sure that some people might have heard or seen attachment styles, but it's really in the recognition of, one, throughout our life stages, but especially in our earlier childhood experiences, the reality is that our families have a big impact in our upbringing, of course, but that really creates our first templates of love. And when we don't experience love that is maybe consistent or secure, the reality is that there might be ways in which we show up later on in life that highlight some of those struggles and that difficulty, right? And so for some people, when they've had a parent who may or may not be really inconsistent in their life, so they may kind of come back and forth. And even let's say you had two parents, one person is consistent and one person is not. The reality is that there's a possibility for folks to develop an anxious attachment style, right? And that might mean that you might feel really nervous that people might leave, that you also are kind of consistently hungering for different ways of a person showing up that may be feeling a little bit unbalanced within your relationships, right? And there might be moments and times where you want to talk yourself out of it and say like, okay, why do I keep running to this person in this way and getting anxious that they're going to leave me? But connecting that deeper childhood experience might be actually the answer that we're looking for. And then there's also the, attachment style of being fearful avoidance. So we may have really difficult times and challenges with conflict, with being really having a lot of maybe blow-ups, I would say, being avoidant of blow-ups, excuse me. And things can just feel really unpredictable, right? And that can also be a reflection of that our parent wasn't able to affirm us in a particular way growing up. And as a result, it becomes really hard for us to, although we want or desire relationships, it becomes hard for us to show up. So we might have a harder time being vulnerable with people, let's say. And then dismissive avoidant as well, right? So we might naturally isolate ourselves and kind of get emotionally distant in different ways in our relationships. And once again, there's not always that intention there, but it's a way or a practice that people might develop for them to feel safe within themselves because they haven't experienced that in not only a parental relationship, because it can be another caregiver, right? So let's say your auntie was the person that raised you as well. Maybe a dynamic that might have happened is as a result of not having a parent, or your auntie could have been somebody who was distant as a result. And so you might have carried on some of those practices as well. And then the secure is kind of, really clear in the sense that we might be able to feel confident in our relationships. And it's not to say you won't have challenges or difficulties, but it's that the way that you show up, it oftentimes maybe not look as disorganized as Issa, Molly, Kelly, so on and so forth. And part of the reason why I brought this here is I think it's just really important as somebody who kind of sits with people and explores their life and explores what is showing up. Oftentimes when we look backwards to look at other parts of your life and how your parents might have shown up, or how other family members, or how, safe or unsafe you might have felt within your home and experiences, this is the thing that we have to talk about, right? Because it does really shape how we see ourselves, how we see our worthiness, and then also how we make connection with other people in our lives. Does anyone have anything that they want to add or share? And I know we need like another full session to talk about attachment as well, but I think it's just important information for people to have. Okay. And part of this series is thinking about gender-based violence and thinking about the toxicity that we mentioned earlier, right? And I know that we've been kind of, especially social media, right? Sometimes we get a word and we cling to it. And toxic is one of those words right now where we're using it consistently. But I thought I would add just some definitions so people can feel connected to certain words. I don't know if anyone listens to the read, but words mean things. And so it's really important that we kind of just figure out ways to describe our experiences so that we feel more affirmed, right? Because there can be a lot of gaslighting that happens in certain relationships. And there's ways that we might even internalize and start self-gaslighting as well. And so I think it's important that we have language and just ways to describe what it is that we're actually talking about when we say toxic relationships, right? So some of those things, and one of the things that I think is important is us talking about power and control, right? That in abusive relationships, in toxic relationships, there is this underlying reality of power and control, that one person is utilizing or pushing or creating a dynamic that is unhealthy, and has to do with how is that person using power in the relationship and how are they using control to impact the other person. And this, of course, can happen in and across our relationships. It can even happen with our parents. It can happen with family members. It can happen in romantic relationships and even friendships. So using intimidation, using emotional abuse, isolation, right? That abuse and toxicity doesn't happen without some level of isolation. Like, how do I remove you from the people that will actually affirm you or actually support you? Or how do I maybe plant seeds that they actually don't care about you and I'm the person that does, right? And that I'm the person that you need to be connected to, even if things get rocky. Minimizing, denying, and blaming. And I think that that's often what I hear and see, and just talking about gaslighting and what that looks like, especially for Black women. Oh my goodness, the internet can feel like a place of just like fires for us in terms of how people try to dismiss our experiences. For people who have children, using children or other family members, I would say, whether it be, telling your mom or other family members. And then using male privilege, but I also want to acknowledge the fact that there are lots of different same-sex folks and gender-loving people. And so like male privilege isn't necessarily the best term, but how is that person using their particular gender privilege in a relationship? And then also economic abuse. So I worked for several years at a violence against women shelter. And the reality is that oftentimes, in addition to children and many other things, economic abuse is one of the ways that people are forced to stay in relationships that are abusive, right? Because there is a level of either that person taking all of your money or a person using money and financial resources to place you in a really vulnerable position. And then the last thing in the power control wheel is using coercion and threats, and that can look like many, many, many different things. But I once again just wanted to place this here because I think it's important that people feel like they can describe their experiences or even make better connections to some of the experiences that they might have seen from other people in their life as well. And lastly, this aspect of self-gaslighting. And so what I will say, excuse me, my computer's about to die, is that I really want to acknowledge that people gaslight you when you're in toxic relationships, right? And the reality is that there might be moments or times where you slowly begin to question, like, did that happen in that way? Or maybe I'm making too much of a big deal of this, right? And so I want you to be really careful about those times, because there's the natural reality that we can begin slowly internalizing that voice and we begin gaslighting ourselves. And it's important that if we have been in a toxic relationship, that we find ways to resist against that voice, because that voice is often not the truth. All right. And everyone's favorite word, boundaries, right? So I love social media because I think it gets things accessible and people get to talk about really interesting things. But at the same time, I think, part of the challenge is that we romanticize certain things, or it makes it feel like things are really easier. It's like, just have boundaries. It's like, it requires a little bit more energy and work and thinking through. And so I know, I love her too. I love Sunflower too. And so I know that Alana Van Zandt is not everyone's favorite auntie, but I really, really like this definition of boundaries. And I'm wondering if somebody can read it out for us.
I can read it.
Beautiful.
For the purpose of cultivating self-trust, the boundary line is the one you create for yourself, within yourself, and around yourself to keep yourself safe. Your boundaries serve as announcement and display that you are willing to honor and take care of you. Your boundaries are an announcement to other people of your requirements and expectations. They create a structure and parameter for what is and not accepted, permitted, accommodated, and tolerated in your presence and your space.
That's a very powerful definition of boundaries. I saw this a couple years ago, and it's been something that I really keep close to me. And, part of the challenge too is that sometimes we feel like we're just not good at boundaries. We're just not good at boundaries. But when we begin slowly, having a definition that feels like it works for us, that connects us to that, once again, that idea of a richer love and what that looks like. And I know even the pandemic has really highlighted, okay, how do I create boundaries with everybody in my life, right? Because I need a sense of restore on a regular basis. Through really like identifying what boundaries can look like, I think it's a really impactful way to have practical ways forward, so that it doesn't always feel as if it feels too distant, right? And it feels like, especially when you haven't had templates of boundaries and what that looks like in your life. And so I have a small little exercise for us, and it's going to allow us to once again bring everyone's wisdom, but people can be typing this information in. But what I'm going to do is be putting a small little Google Drive link in the chat. And my hope is that we give each other new ways of talking about boundaries, right? Because there's realities that each of you might be really good at one area or have a challenge in another. And this is a perfect moment and point for us to be able to give each other phrases or ways of thinking about these physical, emotional, mental, sexual boundaries. And then material can be things like time as well as money. So give me 1 second here. And so everyone's going to head to this link if it's okay. And I'll show you in 2 seconds how to be able to add your ways of thinking about boundaries so that you can help some of the beautiful people in this space create boundaries in ways that are healthy or the ways that you have found helpful, right? And so I have the areas here, and for some reason I don't have material, but I'll add it just now. And so on the left-hand side of your computer, you're going to see a little thing with a sticky note. So it looks like a little bit of a paper. And you're going to press that, and it automatically a message is going to come up. And you're going to create a message that is connected to the color that you see, right? So if you have a mental boundary, you're going to add it there, and it can be a sentence, it can be a practice. So right there, you have some examples of my capacity is low, right? Social media breaks can be a great way to have mental boundaries. But each of us, I'm going to encourage us to think of at least one way of thinking about some of the boundaries that you see here, so that each of us can find a practical way going forward on how we can better implement the boundaries that we need to create with people. Awesome. So I'm gonna play some music. Feel free to think about it. Think about your favorite go-tos, and then we can go from there.
Really wanna touch me, I really wanna play. I wanna know who are you to me? What are you to? Who are you to me? Trouble you, yeah, tell me she feeling. Tell me she wants me to be one. And calling, then I know that I wanna let you get you gotta go, yes, double, making me feel this. Don't wish to someone.
And if you have more than one, you're more than welcome to add them.
Hi, Emma. Can you show me how to add the sticky note again?
Of course, yeah. So on the left-hand side, there's this little piece of paper. Can you see where my mouse is?
Yeah, okay. Because I was trying to like press from the one you already have and addict it.
Okay, no worries. Yeah, some of the other ones are kind of weird, so yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Problem.
Big Papa, tell me who I got to know there ain't no other. Yeah, damn she feeling, damn she wants me to run. God, but then I know that God is gone. Yeah, when I let you get body. gotta get used to love it, making me feel it. Don't just love it, you ain't gotta leave alone. You ain't gotta go by yourself. Let me take you home. Let me touch you by myself. Touch you by myself. Feel it by myself. You're being alone. Not by your
Maybe we can kind of finish up on a couple of them and then take some of these up. Logging off, calling in, and asking for extensions. Yes. Beautiful. Okay, why don't we start slowly taking these up? And if people want to add, they're more than welcome to. But one, what was it like trying to practically kind of name out and communicate some of the boundaries through this exercise? Was it hard? Did it feel easy? Did it require a little bit of thinking through? Maybe I'll give people a couple more minutes because it seems like folks are still working on it, which is good. Okay. And also everyone will get like the PowerPoint as well as some other resources as well. So this can be something that you carry forward from the session too. Maybe we'll start taking them up now. It seems like there's a little bit of a pause. So how was it? How was it as an exercise to like have the practical means of like thinking about a sentence that can assert a boundary?
I'd say that it felt good to see or remember that I had this in my vocab, and remembering that maybe once before you didn't have this in your vocab.
Definitely, definitely. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, it can become so easy to kind of feel like we just don't know how to do it or we don't know how to get started. Eniola? I think I saw a hand up. I'm pretty sure. Eniola, you can feel free to unmute. I think I see your hand up. You're the accident. And then Rachel had placed in the chat, it made me think about the difficulty between being assertive and not too passive. Yes, absolutely. Awesome. And what is it like? I think it's also really amazing to see other people's boundaries. Like, how do they say those things, right? Because we can kind of use that as our new practice. So we'll take a couple of them up, and if anything else stands out, people feel free to share. Excuse me, sorry. All right, so logging off, calling in, asking for extensions. Yes, 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 and yes. Especially because, you know, I know a couple of people here might be students. And it's really, really important that we restore, right? So one is that we are on computers, on our TVs, on our computers, on our phones from morning till night. And it is exhausting, especially, we haven't even really had the opportunity to talk about the pandemic, but there's a big sense of fatigue that we might be feeling and experiencing. And so really allowing yourself the ability to log off. And, you know, I can't remember who was talking about really asking for help, right? And sometimes that's in your relationships, but sometimes that's also in your spaces. So thinking about whether it be your community spaces, but also things like school. I'm also a counselor at Ryerson, And, you know, for folks who don't know, and I'm information person, so give you the information, you do what you like with it, share it with another person, all that good stuff. So one is usually all of our universities have some form of counseling centers in the spaces that they're in. And typically those counseling centers, one, are free. And two, the other option is that through your university or college benefits, you might actually have access to funding. So I know from working at Ryerson that if students don't opt out of getting private insurance, so you typically will automatically have some sort of insurance, whether it's Green Shield or other things, you get $1,000, right? Which is a decent amount of money to be able to bring towards counseling. And Dr. Tepo has also reminded me, and thank you for sharing this so much, is that folks who are 16 to 22 years old can access therapy at Future Black Female as well. And I'm sure she can also add on the website link as well for people to be able to have access to as well. But part of the reason why I was bringing up school is that there is accommodation centers. So if, you know, anxiety or depression or other challenges are something that you're living with, and you attend your accommodations center and you get a formalized support of accommodations, then that's a way for you to support and get those extensions. But then also like having conversations with your professors. And I know sometimes that can be hard. And I know sometimes, especially right now with the pandemic, there's so many challenges of like how you connect with your professors or maybe how insensitive certain professors are. But it is really important that we advocate for ourselves in a lot of ways in school, because otherwise nobody else is going to do it for us. And it's just an important part of setting yourself up for success. So long spiel, but it's something really, really important. And Dr. Tepo has also added that link in the chat for people to access free therapy. And I'll also email out some different resources for people to access as well. Okay, I would rather speak on the phone today. I'd rather speak on the phone than text. I've had a long day, absolutely. And I'm also the opposite. I'm like, I'd rather text or send a voice note when I have the headspace to do it, because talking on the phone sometimes feels hard after a long day. But each of us can figure out what is it that we want to communicate to people about mental boundaries, right? And just letting people know I'm overwhelmed at the moment, right? I'm overwhelmed. I don't have the capacity to deal with this anymore. And I know a lot of people have been maybe trying to do this as a new practice. Sometimes we have really amazing people in our lives and they end up being the safe person that we go to. But, you know, just asking people like, do you have the space to deal with this can be a really helpful thing, because sometimes we have no idea what happened in that other person's day. And you might be the friend that's always showing up for people as well. So maybe figuring out a way to communicate like how you and your friends or you and your family members can talk about how you show up. And then asking like, do you have the space to listen to this story or experience today? Social media breaks. Yes, definitely. I understand that you're asking because you care, but I would not like to talk about school stress until I bring it up. Yes, yes. And I know for some people, they might just always think it's like a casual conversation, but school can be so anxiety provoking for so many different reasons. And this is a beautiful way to be able to kind of let people know that, one, I can see that you care, but the other thing is that I'm just not in the headspace to talk about it, and that's okay. So things of spiritual boundaries, that doesn't support my spirit. You do not get to tell me what my relationship with God should look like. It is sacred. Absolutely. Absolutely. Can I have a hug? Right? I remember starting to work at the shelter, and my manager at the time, this is the first time I heard somebody saying, oh, I don't let my daughter just hug random people. I was like, what? And I didn't understand what that meant at the moment, but I thought it was such a beautiful way of being able to allow young people to assert who they feel like comfortable hugging. And I think it's really important sometimes that we also ask that to people in our lives as well as a physical boundary. You know, saying, I don't want to be touched right now. I need my space. I don't feel comfortable going there, maybe next time. I only have enough for myself at the moment. And I'm too burnt out to have a night out, but I'm hoping to join you at another time. Yes, yes, and yes. I love this one. No is a complete sentence. And that could be in those sexual boundaries, but also across all of these other boundaries around mental, emotional, material. No one is entitled to my sex life. I'm not interested. I'm not willing to compromise myself for your needs. Absolutely. And this one is a really important one that I think is really important when you're in physically intimate relationships with people. is talking about physical boundaries and safe words before an act and any sexual act takes place as well. And emotional boundaries. I don't feel safe, so I won't let you into this part of my life, even if you may feel like you are entitled to it. Ooh, you guys are giving me some really, really good ones. These are ones I'm going to steal for myself. If you raise your voice at me, I'm going to have to end this conversation. Absolutely, right? And for some people, and especially community-wise, you can be like, oh, we're just talking. But no, that's a trigger for me, and I don't feel comfortable or safe when your voice is that elevated and we're trying to have a conversation. Awesome. So a lot of new takeaways. I'm wondering if there's anyone that's found one boundary that they maybe never felt that they would be good at, that now they feel like with this exercise, they have a new way of going forward with it. Any one of the boundaries stand out that you maybe never even thought was a boundary? All right. Beautiful. Well, thank you everyone for just engaging in the exercise. Whether we share it or not, I'm sure folks were able to take just new ways of thinking about boundaries and communicating them. And like someone else mentioned, just being able to recognize that you have the ability to respond, right? You have the ability to communicate boundaries, although it may not always feel like it. And like I said, we'll send this out to people so that they can have access to it as well. Okay. And so I know like it was a little bit of a trend a little while ago for like us to be talking about red flags, right? With all those emojis. But I think that boundaries exercises are really, really good way of indicating and talking about then what are some of your red flags. But one of the things that we don't focus enough on is like that yellow space and that green space as well. And so one of the things that I think is really important, we begin slowly highlighting is, okay, in connection to this idea of, oh, excuse me, I don't think, can you all see the PowerPoint that I have now? Yeah? So, okay. In connection to the ideas around a richer love, what are the green flags, right? Like, what are the things that make you feel comfortable, that make you feel safe, that make you feel seen, that will allow you to proceed with somebody in relationship? And we can once again connect this in your friendships, in your partnerships, and also in your family. So green flags, the things that are amazing.
One thing for me is when a person can admit that they're wrong. Yeah, I don't know. I've been working on like addressing conflict and things like that, and concerns with how someone has said a thing to me. And especially with like this one guy friend I had, and then as I've been conversation, it just felt easy. And that's so strange to me, just because as my dad and my parents, like never really admitting when they're wrong and just saying like, oh, I can see how you felt that way, and I'm sorry. So that felt really good to me.
Yes. And that acknowledgement, right? Because you really, I think it's just so important sometimes when people can acknowledge, yeah, I was wrong, and I really want to rectify it. I want you to continue to trust me. And I know people make jokes or fun of like, oh, our parents sometimes will give us food as their apology, right? But sometimes we really need to have and identify conversations as a helpful way of going forward, so that there can be a true way of moving forward. So thank you for sharing that. Your apology, and I know we talk about often love languages, but there's apology languages as well that I think is important for people to see. Awesome. What about other people? Green flags, the things that make you feel amazing in relationships. Absolutely, yes. When people listen to understand and not to respond or not to rebuttal, yes. Jade, go ahead.
For me, I feel like a green flag is someone who like respects my need for alone time, like doesn't get upset when I say like, hey, like maybe can we not do like that 4 hour FaceTime today? I'm like kind of tired.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The just the ways that people respect your boundaries on a daily basis can be so helpful. And then we also have in the chat when people don't judge, right? Like it's hard enough to show up in relationships and be vulnerable. And when we feel a sense of judgment, that can completely shut us down. And then that brings up all those bricks that we talked about earlier as well. Any other green flags, the flags that just make you smile, make you feel comfortable, make you feel like the person is your person in whatever way possible. Compliments. Yes, I love to be complimented, honey. Yes, like when people and there's lots of ways to compliment. It's like I appreciate you is a compliment, right? There's so many ways. I wonder what people feel. Oh, there's some more coming in. Emotional intelligence. Yes. Someone understanding and the importance of mental health. Absolutely. And especially in this climate, right? I think we've often talked about just the fact that there's been so much stigma around mental health. And finally, as we chip away at that, understanding what that means is really, really important for people to feel safe in relationships. And gentleness, yes. And that looks different for each of us, but how do we show up gentle, right? How do we show up compassionate in our relationships and not coming from that harsh place? Loving me for who I am, absolutely. And it goes to connect with that piece around self-acceptance that Carrie Ann had told us about before. Supportive of goals and interests. Yes, like how do you check back in and say, okay, how did your busy workday go when you had all these things, or how did those school assignments go, right? Like how does people show up for you and affirm that they're just interested and care about your goals, right? In whatever way that looks like. Any other green flags that make people feel great? Okay, we had a good list, so thank you for that. And we did a lot of work in terms of thinking about our bricks and thinking about boundaries. And I hope through that exercise, people can begin to identify what are your yellows, which is like, what are the areas in relationships where something feels off and you need to slow down, right? Like something needs to be communicated. And then what are our reds, right? And through that boundaries exercise, hopefully people were able to kind of connect to what you already knew were some of your red flags. But hopefully maybe it gave you a new perspective of, okay, what are some other red flags that you might have and you want to be mindful of? So just in case there is a boundary cross, that there's a way for you to be aware that that makes you feel uncomfortable. All right. I'm a big poem person. I love poems. I love poetry. I love art in general. So I always look for just different ways that we can feel the words in a new way. Because yeah, sometimes it's hard to talk about constantly. And this is one of my favorite poems about just redefining love. I'm wondering if somebody would feel comfortable to read it for us.
I can read it.
Beautiful.
You can completely redefine my idea of what love is and should be. That it needn't be possessive, volatile, or detrimental to your well-being, but can be selfless, gentle, and consistent, and should empower you to pursue your passions. That it should balance and enrich a life, not tear it to pieces.
Yes. I don't know, there's something about each of those words that connect to what we talked about earlier, about our flags, about some of our bricks, but then about what it can look like, right? What it can look like when a love is consistent, when a love is selfless, when a love is gentle and enriching. So thank you for reading that out for us. Any feelings that people got when they heard those words? I think the first thing I think of is like being seen. Jade, what about you?
I feel like when I heard the part about like love not having to be volatile, I feel like that really like stuck with me just because I feel like we're in a culture right now where like toxicity is like really played up. Like there's a lot, I see a lot of jokes around like, oh, I blocked you, but why don't you not, how come you're not trying to email me to try to talk to me? And it's like,
Yeah,
okay, I hope you guys know that this is not healthy.
yeah,
And like,
yeah,
this is not what should
definitely.
be happening. So
Hmm.
like, when I see like volatile, I'm just like, yeah, it shouldn't be.
Yeah.
Cause it's fun and jokes in the moment, but like when it's consistently happening, it's like, okay, I'm tired now.
Definitely, definitely. I totally agree with that. And that was such a good example and connector. I'm sure a lot of us have seen it, but and the other thing to think about sometimes too is that, we use humor to hide the truth. And so sometimes, we're kind of kikiing, but what is the deeper message behind what is being communicated, right? And you hit it on the nail in the sense that, like, is this healthy? Like, is this a richer love? Like, is that what it's supposed to look like? Hey,
And something else, can I add to?
of course, yeah, of course.
Sorry. And it also makes me think about how, like, life is hard and a little volatile and things like that. Love should be like a safe place to land
Yes,
amidst all that.
absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Any other things that people felt when they heard these words? Inyola?
It kind of reminded me of like the definition of love that Bell Hooks gives in her book, like your growth in someone else's, and like the quote talks about balancing and enriching in life and not tearing it into pieces. So.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. That like we're really reciprocal, mutual caring of one another and what it looks like to hold each other with that type of intention. Beautiful. And self-esteem, right? So, this is once again, there's so many things that we can like talk about forever. Relationships is one of them, but so is self-esteem, and especially what that looks like for Black women. And as we think about what the importance, rest in peace, Bell Hooks. That really took me to another place. Bell Hooks has provided us so much different knowledge and resource, and so may she rest in peace. And so, part of the work as well, especially when we think about our boundaries and our bricks and our life experiences and our attachment, is thinking about self-esteem, right? Like, how do we, and I think somebody was mentioning it before, around just the consideration, I think it was Carrie Ann, yes, around self-acceptance, around the fact that as Black women, we're taught to be showing up smaller. And when you show up as your full self, you're often, placed in really negative ways. And the reality is that we really have to hold and challenge some of the life experiences that we've had or the people in our lives so that we can have a higher esteem for ourselves as well, right? And self-esteem refers to a person's overall sense of their, I should have placed there, this is like a literal definition that often pops up, of people's value or worth. And it can be considered a sort of measure of how a person values, approves, appreciates, prizes, or likes themselves, right? And some of the facets of that is our confidence, is how we kind of connect to our identity, is, where are the spaces we feel a sense of belonging, and oftentimes when we may feel disconnected to our belonging, and we have a very unique experience of that as Black women, is like, we are navigating the world as Black women and folks, and that can be really complicated, especially in a white, supremacist reality. And what are the ways that we are not affirmed? But I think one of the things that we often have to pull from when we think about people like Bell Hooks, or we think about people in our lives that care about us, and even our ancestors, right? Like, what does it mean to embrace our identities unapologetically? And I know that takes time and effort, and lots of challenging, and even still, we might experience different, racial traumas that impact our lives, and misogynoir and what that looks like. But at the same time, we have to constantly fill ourselves, fill our cups in ways that allow us to esteem ourselves, so that we move in the world in a way that feels wholesome to us. And I know sometimes that can be hard because of the ways that Black women and folks are treated, but it is critical for us to lean into spaces that affirm our esteem, right? And, you know, future Black female can be one of those spaces, but also I want to encourage people to think about like, how can some of the spaces, whether it be your friends or family or other, you know, spiritual spaces, also be a space to help affirm who you are and your value in this world as well. And, you know, we're gonna go to our last bit in a second, but I think that it requires, a richer love requires new vows for ourselves, right? And we often talk about vows in weddings and marriages, and we're in the longest marriage that we'll ever be in is with ourselves, right? It is recognizing that we are in a perpetual relationship with us. And we have to make big, big intentions, especially when we're thinking about a richer love, when we're thinking about resisting and releasing some of the things that we might have seen that are unhealthy, that haven't been nurturing to us, and are really against our value as Black people. And so I have a couple things to think about, right? And, you know, folks can, if they feel comfortable, can respond to these, but maybe they kind of write them down as like, what are the new ways that you want to make vows to yourself to have that richer love, right? And so I'll read out some of the sentences, and if people can say, you know, or indicate an action, then that's absolutely fine. And once again, you're going to get this, so you'll have it as a reference as well. But one of the questions I have is, how can I vow to make a new relationship with positive self-esteem, right? So does that mean I got to unfollow a couple accounts? Does that mean I can't listen to certain podcasts and that I should be listening to maybe other podcasts that are a little bit more affirming to me? Is it, and also one of the things I want to talk about, and we didn't get a chance to, as well as, you know, the narratives that we might hold and have, right? And how do we vow to transform our self-talk? And, you know, somebody was talking about, like, I want to be able to release myself from a toxic relationship. And so one of the things that I would encourage us to think about then is, what are some of the thoughts that we're carrying, or the beliefs that we're carrying that might actually also be keeping us in that relationship? Is it that you don't believe anybody else will love you or care for you? Is it that you feel like this is the normal aspects of love? And so I'm going to encourage people to think about, how do you vow to transform your self-talk that allows you to dive into a deeper sense of a richer love for yourself? I'll name a couple of others, and people, once again, if you feel comfortable at any point, feel free to raise your hand and we can go from there. I vow to invest in my healing by. Dr. Tepo already shared the access to free resources at mental health within the organization. There's an organization called Women's Health in Women's Hands that people can access mental health resources as well. And like I said, I'll also share a lot of free resources in an email coming to you soon. I vow to prioritize my needs, right? So what does that look like to prioritize your needs in relationships with other people, in relationship with yourself? What will you do differently, right? Will you begin asking for help? Will you begin telling people no? Will you begin saying, I actually can't do that right now because I'm burnt out and I'm tired and I don't have the space for it? And then I vow to connect to my tribe, right? So the reality is that hopefully you have at least one person that you consider to be a tribe person, right? Consider to be a person where you can let your shoulders down, where you don't feel like you have to perform or that there's no mask. And what does it look like to connect to your tribe in a more meaningful way? And last but not least is, how do I forgive myself? You know, the reality is that sometimes relationships can really place some damage on us. And we can be so hard on ourselves in how we move forward. And one of the things that I think is so key is that we forgive ourselves for the things that we did not know, and the things that we are choosing to do going forward. So thinking about what will be your vow of forgiveness to yourself can also be a really critical way to pour into that richer love. And so I'll read some of the things in the chat. And if anyone else wants to add something that they felt or experienced, or might be their new vow to themselves, feel free to share. It says, I vow to invest in my healing by creating boundaries and knowing when to let things go. Absolutely. And that ties into, you know, the Things Fall Apart book that we talked about earlier as well. And it says, I vow to prioritize my needs over my wants. Ooh, that's a good one. That's a good one. Thank you for sharing that. Any other vows people want to name in the chat, or just things that came up when I began giving them these prompts? Well, it's lots to think about, and I know it can be just a really interesting space. And like I said earlier, you'll have access to this going forward. Um, but it gives you the space to make new promises to yourself, right? And I think that that's the most critical piece. I vow to forgive myself by letting go of the past. Absolutely, absolutely. So firstly, I want to thank everyone. Obviously, I want to thank Dr. Teffel and Future Black Female for inviting me. But I also want to really thank all of you. I know relationships is just a hard thing to talk about, and everyone, and even your virtual, and even that's complicated. And I appreciate your vulnerability in being able to have this conversation and learn from one another, but also hopefully see that you're not alone. And there's lots of different ways and connections that we're each holding as Black women when we talk about relationships and healthier relationships. And hopefully as we move forward to richer senses of love, that we also begin to feed into that a little bit differently as well. So for those of you who know me, I love this exercise called Head, Heart, and Feet, which is, just identifying something that you're thinking, something that you're feeling, and maybe something that you're taking away from today's conversation and session. I had an interesting experience recently where, somebody in my life previously kind of came back up. And I thought it was such an interesting thing that I was talking about a richer love, right? And so I think one of the things I'm thinking about is how do I intend to actually go back to some of the vows that I placed there and reflect on them in myself, because don't get it twisted, therapists and people that are working in this field are also sometimes navigating interesting stuff around relationships. And so it's important that we all make the space to always consistently reflect, right? That it's not like, okay, once I'm in, done 5 or 6 sessions of therapy, that I'm completely able to be removed from certain things. The reality is that life will also become a teacher, right? And relationships will become teachers in different parts of your life. And so I think what I'm thinking about and taking away is that we always have to be mindful of the fact that relationships are ever moving and changing. And as we grow and evolve, we get new ways of reconnecting with experiences and really figuring out if we learned the lesson of past. Yes, and Sabat saying we're always a work in progress. Absolutely. Anyone want to share something that they're thinking, something they're feeling, or something that they're taking away from today's conversation? And Dr. Teppo had also placed not too long ago, if people, before they leave, if they don't mind, just also adding to the poll, filling out the poll. It's really important to just make sure we're doing really amazing work and that they continue to figure out what do people need, what do people look for, and what would be helpful for them. Okay, and then I have somebody here said my feelings are valid. I feel a good and positive energy. Amazing. Any other folks want to share something you're thinking or feeling or taking away from today's conversation? Maybe I can also invite people, if you haven't had a chance to share anything before and you feel comfortable, you can do it in the chat. You can message me privately and I can share. Just wanting to open up the space to see if there's any other things that maybe stood out or resonated to you. I'm thinking that I should stay firm on the boundaries I decided to set for myself this year without feeling guilt about them. Yes and yes, right? And I think that that's one of the things that we often feel is like, what's on the other side of this? How's the other person gonna feel? But if we go back to that definition, it's about creating parameters that protect you. So thank you for sharing that. Awesome. Any other final thoughts from anybody that feeling comfortable to share about anything that you feel like you took away from today's session or conversation? Alrighty. Well, thank you again, everyone. I really appreciate your time and your energy. And I know that it's, it was snowing all day. So it also puts us all in a mood, but I appreciate you staying on and just sharing your experiences. And I know that there's so many ways that you learn from one another. And I have one other comment here that says, I am deserving of gentle love, which begins with me loving myself. Yes, yes, yes. And that's the note that we'll definitely leave off on. Thank you, thank you, thank you, everyone who came. I really, really appreciate your presence here and your time. Feel free to stay connected to me. There's lots of ways to get connected, and we can continue the conversation in different ways. Dr. Teppel, I will allow you to kind of take things away.
Thanks, Amma, and thanks everyone for turning up, for participating, for being vulnerable. Amma will be back on March 9th to continue the conversation. So check our website. There's a calendar of events and you'll find the link there, and more of our gender-based violence speaker series. Thanks again, Amma. If you do need psychotherapy, we do offer therapy for 16 to 22. It's free for Black girls, Black women. And we have therapists from around the country. So if you're in Alberta, we'll try and match you with someone closer to you, because I know time differences can be a little bit difficult to work with. So thanks again to everyone, and come back on March 9th to continue this discussion with Amma. On February the 21st, we have our Black History Month event, and throughout February, we'll have Mental Health Mondays. So again, check out our website. You'll see all of our events, all of the programs we offer, all of the services we offer. Take care and good night.
I'm sorry, there was one question about the slides. So I don't know if everyone had a chance to register, but I will send the slides to you, Dr. Teppel. And then you can send it out. And if people didn't get a chance to register, I will just contact me and I'll send you the slides as well. Awesome. Take care, everyone.